The scent of orange blossoms and sweat, a perfume worn only by the desperate and the divine, clung to the velvet curtains of the bedchamber. Outside, the gardens of Versailles exhaled the damp chill of a late autumn night. But in here, the air was thick with the heat of 100 beeswax candles, and the silent, suffocating weight of a king's gaze. He watched her from across the room, his eyes, weary from decades of absolute power, tracing the curve of her throat where a river of diamonds pulsed with her own frantic heartbeat. She was not a queen. She was not even a duchess. She was a ghost from the gutters of Paris, a phantom of pleasure and poverty, now haunting the most sacred rooms of the French monarchy, and she knew, with the cold certainty of a gambler who has pushed all their chips to the center of the table, that one misplaced word, one smile held a second too long, and the same gilded doors that had welcomed her would seal her tomb. A floorboard creaked behind the damask tapestry. A servant, an assassin. In this palace, they were often one and the same. She did not flinch. She had learned long ago that fear was a luxury only the truly safe could afford. Instead, she met the king's gaze in the mirror, offering a reflection of the desire he wished to see. A perfect, beautiful lie. And as his lips curved into a possessive smile, she wondered if he had any idea of the fires she had walked through to stand here, barefoot on his obeisant carpet, a creature of exquisite artifice, forged in the filth and fury of a forgotten world. Good evening, my friend, wherever you find yourself tonight. Whether bathed in the sterile glow of a computer screen or curled in the familiar comfort of your own bed, I welcome you back to the shadows of history. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Which city, which town, which quiet corner of the globe holds you as we prepare to unearth another soul from the graveyard of the past? Leave a whisper of your presence in the comments below, a small signal to others that in this vast and lonely darkness, we are listening together. And if these stories of forgotten lives resonate with the echo in your own heart, I invite you to become a permanent shadow here, to subscribe, and to wander with us again through the whispered corridors of time. Now, take a deep breath. Let the world outside fade away. The story does not begin in this candlelit cage of a palace. It begins in a place so humble, so drenched in the ordinary, that its name was little more than a murmur on the wind. The name itself sounded like a sigh. It was a village folded into the soft, green flesh of northeastern France. A place where time was measured not by clocks, but by the slow, inexorable turning of the seasons. It smelled of damp earth, baking bread, and the sweet, decaying perfume of hay in the autumn rain. In the summer of 1743, under a sky the color of washed-out linen, a child was born without ceremony or celebration. In a cottage whose thatched roof wept with every storm, a seamstress named Anne Becue gave birth to a daughter. The child arrived into the world with a silence that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. They named her Jeanne. Anne's tears were not of joy, but of a grim, bone-deep relief. She had survived. The child had survived. In a world where survival was the only prayer that mattered, it was enough. Of the father, no one spoke aloud, but whispers are the true currency of any small village. Some said he was a soldier, a fleeting shadow who had marched on, leaving nothing but a memory and a life behind. But the more persistent rumor, the one that clung to Jeanne like a second skin for the rest of her days, was that of a friar, a man of God named Brother Ange Gomard, whose piety was matched only by the unnerving intensity of his gaze. He was a man known for his kindness, a collector of alms for the poor, who had lingered in the village just long enough to sow a seed in the most forbidden of soils. The truth, whatever it was, became a ghost, a story told by firelight that changed with each telling. But what was certain was this: a woman of no means but possessed of a quiet, resilient grace, raised her daughter alone. There, life was a tapestry, woven from thread and tenderness, Their small home was a fortress against the world's indifference, filled with the clean, calming scent of the lavender set, and tucked into the linens she sewed for others. Jeanne grew up in the shadow of her mother's labor, playing at her feet amongst the scraps of silk and cotton, tracing invisible castles in the dust motes that danced in the slivers of sunlight. The world outside was a vast, unknowable thing. Their window, clouded with the breath of years, looked out onto fields of wheat that bent and swayed in the wind like a golden ocean. At night, Anne would tell her stories, not of princes and princesses, but of clever women who had outwitted famine, outlasted cruel husbands, and found strength in the cracks of a broken world. It was an education in resilience, a quiet armoring of the soul. This life, this small, predictable orbit of survival, might have been Jeanne's forever, but fate is rarely content to leave beauty undisturbed. One afternoon, it arrived in a carriage that seemed to have rolled out of another dimension. It was a lacquered beast of black and gold, pulled by 4 horses whose coats gleamed with a health the villagers could only dream of. The crowd parted, their faces a mixture of awe and resentment. From this chariot of the gods stepped a man named Jean-Baptiste Denis de Monceau. He was a financier, a tax farmer, a man whose wealth was so immense it was practically a nationality unto itself. He was traveling, weary, and seeking a place to rest. He found himself at the local inn, the very same inn where Anne Becky was delivering a freshly mended gown for the innkeeper's wife. The meeting was a collision of 2 worlds. He, a man who could buy and sell entire villages. She, a woman whose entire net worth was tied up in her needles and thread. Witnesses would later say that a strange quiet descended upon the room. It was not love at first sight, but something far more potent, recognition. He saw in her a desperate beauty, and in the small, silent child clinging to her skirts, an unpolished diamond. Within a month, the impossible happened. The carriage returned, not for a fleeting visit, but with an invitation, an offer to leave the mud and mediocrity of the coolers behind and come to Paris as his ward. The village exploded with scandalized whispers. She was his mistress, they hissed. He was a predator, she a whore. But Anne, who had spent a lifetime mending the silks of other, wealthier women, who knew the bitter taste of poverty with an intimacy that left no room for pride, accepted. She was not just choosing a new life for herself. She was gambling on a future for her daughter. A future where Jeanne would wear the silks, not merely sew them. The journey to Paris was a violent birth into a new reality. For Jeanne, barely 6 years old, it was a dizzying, terrifying spectacle. The world she knew dissolved into a blur of green and brown. The rhythmic groan of the carriage wheels a constant, unsettling hum. Paris. When they finally arrived, it was not a city, but a monster. It rose from the earth in a chaotic symphony of stone and smoke, a living, breathing creature that smelled of river mud, roasting meat, perfumes, and human filth. It roared with the voices of a million souls, the clang of blacksmiths' hammers, the relentless tolling of 100 church bells, and the chilling shriek of laughter from hidden alleyways. It was glorious and grotesque, a paradise and a prison built side. De Monceau installed them in his Parisian residence, a place of dizzying ceilings and velvet curtains so thick they swallowed the sound of the world outside. But this was no simple act of charity. In the house lived another woman, de Monceau's official mistress, a sophisticated creature of indeterminate age whose beauty was as carefully maintained as the formal gardens. Far from being a rival, she became a peculiar sort of tutor to Jeanne. Whether from a sense of noblesse oblige or simple boredom, she took the wild little girl from the countryside under her wing. She taught Jeanne how to walk without looking at her feet, how to hold a fork as if it were a scepter, how to use a smile as both a shield and a weapon. Jeanne absorbed these lessons with a preternatural calm, a quiet, watchful sponge soaking in the strange, coded language of the elite. She was learning that in this world, survival was not about resilience, but about performance. The years slipped by. Jeanne grew, her body stretching into a willowy grace, her hair a pale, shimmering gold that seemed to hoard the light in the city's perpetual gloom. She was a paradox. A girl with the calloused soul of a peasant and the budding poise of a courtier. The servants saw it, whispering that she carried herself with an air of command that could not be taught. It was in this environment that the decision was made, not by her mother, but by the powerful people who now owned her future. She was too bright, too beautiful, to be left to chance. She needed to be refined, polished, and, most importantly, educated. And so, at the age of 9, she was sent away to the convent of St. The convent was a fortress of piety on a hill overlooking the city. A place of gray stone and silent prayer. The life was Spartan, ruled by the ringing of bells that sliced the day into rigid segments of worship and work. The nuns, with their pale, bloodless faces, taught her Latin, theology, literature, and the intricate art of needlepoint. They preached humility while surrounded by the gilded trappings of the church. They taught her to subdue her spirit, to muffle her laughter, to confess her sins in a hushed whisper. Jeanne learned to read, to write, to think. But the most important lesson she learned at Saint-Oire was the art of the mask. She learned to present a face of serene piety while her mind roamed free, hungry for the vibrant, sinful world she could see glittering in the distance from her dormitory window. For 8 years, she lived this life of disciplined silence. She scrubbed cold stone floors until her knuckles were raw, her breath pluming in the frigid morning air. She chanted psalms in a chapel that smelled of cold incense and melting wax. She watched the seasons change through a barred window, a passive observer of a life that was happening elsewhere, to other people. When she looked at her own reflection, fleetingly caught in the polished brass of an altar candlestick, she saw a stranger, a girl with the eyes of an old woman, a girl who was waiting, with the infinite, terrifying patience of a predator, for the gates of her cage to finally swing open. The day they did, she was 15. A young woman, poised on the razor's edge between the innocence that had been stripped from her and the knowledge she had yet to acquire. Stepping out into the unfiltered sunlight, she felt a wave of dizziness. The world was too loud, too bright, too full of smells she had almost forgotten. The scent of Paris, that intoxicating cocktail of ambition and decay, rushed into her lungs, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she could never go back. Not to the convent, not to the quiet, simple life of the carriage that came for her rattled over the cobblestones, and as she looked back, the convent tower shrank into the distance, becoming just another gray steeple in a forest of stone. The road ahead was shrouded in the gathering dusk, and as the first stars began to prick the velvet sky, Jeanne rested her head against the cool glass of the window, feeling the vibration of the wheels in her very bones. She was no longer a child. She was a product, carefully crafted and educated, returning to the city that had made her, unaware that she was destined not just to live in it, but to one day rule its heart from the bed of a king. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed the landscape was the flicker of a distant light. A single candle in a far-off window, a tiny, defiant flame burning against the vast, indifferent night. The candle in the carriage window sputtered, its small flame casting a frantic, dancing light across Jeanne's face. Each jolt of the wheels over the rutted road threatened to extinguish it. Yet it clung to life, a tiny, golden heartbeat in the overwhelming darkness. She watched it with a detached intensity, seeing in its struggle a mirror of her own fragile existence. When dawn finally broke, it was not with a gentle blush, but with a dirty, gray light that revealed Paris rising from the morning mist like a sunken city. The candle was dead, a curl of black smoke clinging to the wick, and Jeanne felt a profound sense of aloneness settle over her. The city she returned to was not the one she had left. Or perhaps, she was not the same girl. Her mother, Anne, met her at the gates of a modest boarding house. The years of anxiety had etched new lines around her eyes. And her hands, though no longer rough from a seamstress's toil, were never still. Their embrace was strained, a collision of a past they could no longer share and a future they could not predict. The world that had seemed so promising had crumbled. De Monceau, their powerful benefactor, had vanished from their lives. His patronage as fleeting as a summer storm. His mistress, Jeanne's former tutor, was gone too. Anne had remarried, not to a man of wealth or stature, but to a small-time shopkeeper, a man whose kindness was soured by the constant worry of debt. The shop smelled of rancid cooking oil and cheap vinegar, a stark, nauseating contrast to the clean, cold incense of the convent. This was her new reality, a cramped room, a resentful stepfather, and a future that had shrunk from a grand horizon to the four walls of this struggling business. The poise and education she had acquired at Saint-Oray were useless here. In this world, she was once again just a pretty face, and worse, a mouth to feed. Paris, which had once seemed a city of infinite possibility, now looked at her with cold indifference. She was just another piece of driftwood in its vast, relentless current. But the girl who had survived the convents, discipline was not one to drown easily. Desperation became her fuel. She began to walk the city. Her convent taught grace, a strange and striking contrast to the squalor of the streets she now navigated. She learned the city's secret language, the glance that offered a meal, the touch that offered a threat, the smile that could disarm a creditor. For a time, she found work in a milliner's shop. Her delicate fingers, once trained in the art of theological embroidery, now arranging feathers and ribbons on hats for women whose lives she could only imagine. Men would stop, ostensibly to look at the wares, but their eyes would linger on her. She learned to wield their admiration like a shield, her polite, distant smiles promising everything and nothing at all. When the pittance from the shop was not enough, she became an artist's model, a living statue in a freezing studio, her body draped in cheap cloth meant to imitate the robes of goddesses and saints. She learned to hold a pose for hours, her muscles screaming in protest, her mind detaching from the physical world, retreating to a place of silent observation. She watched the artists, the poets, the so-called bohemians who frequented the studio. She saw their passion, but also their pettiness, their grand artistic ambitions, and their grubby, desperate realities. It was another kind of education, one far more brutal and honest than the one the nuns had provided. It was in this shadowy, half-starved world that she met him. His name was Nicolas Baptiste Lamont, a young hairdresser with gentle hands and the eyes of a doomed poet. His shop was a tiny, fragrant haven, smelling of almond oil and hot irons. The work was demanding, but there was an intimacy to it, a strange power in transforming the appearance of others. Lamont fell for her not with a sudden passion, but with a slow, creeping adoration. He watched the way the light caught in her hair, the quiet efficiency of her movements. He brought her small, pathetic gifts, a single, slightly wilted flower, a stale pastry from the bakery next door. To Jeanne, who had known only transactions and patronage, his guileless affection was a foreign and intoxicating thing. They became lovers. Their affair, a secret whispered in the cramped room behind the shop. The scent of hair powder a constant witness. For a brief, fleeting moment, her life felt almost normal. She allowed herself to believe in this simple, fragile happiness. But Paris does not suffer such delusions for long. Lamont's mother, a woman with a face like a clenched fist and a heart full of venomous piety, discovered their affair. She saw Jeanne not as a lover, but as a succubus, a temptress sent from hell to ruin her son. A vicious, public confrontation ensued, the mother's shrieks echoing down the narrow street, accusing Jeanne of witchcraft, of theft, of being a whore who had ensnared her innocent boy. Lamotte, weak and terrified, tried to defend her, but his mother's will was a tidal wave that swept him away. The scandal was a stain that could not be washed out. And then, the ultimate complication. Jeanne discovered she was pregnant. The news broke Lamotte completely. Pressured by his mother, who threatened him with disinheritance and damnation, he fled. He disappeared from her life as suddenly as he had entered it, leaving behind nothing but the lingering scent of almond oil and a child growing in her womb. Jeanne was utterly alone. She gave birth to a daughter, a tiny, fragile creature she named Maregi. Holding the infant in her arms, she felt a surge of love so fierce it was terrifying, followed by the cold, crushing reality of her situation. She was a ruined woman with an illegitimate child, a pariah in a city that had no mercy for fallen angels. With a heart that felt like it was being torn from her chest, she did the only thing she could. She took the infant to her mother, entrusting her to Anne's care, promising to send what little money she could, promising to return one day as a woman who could offer her daughter more than a life of shame and poverty. It was an act of profound sacrifice, a severing of her own heart for the sake of her child's future. Pride, she learned, was a form of armor forged in the coldest fires of shame. She descended further into the Parisian underworld, a ghost haunting the edges of polite society. She worked briefly as a companion to a wealthy, decrepit widow, a living fossil rattling around in a mansion filled with ghosts and clocks. But the house was a trap. The widow's sons, their eyes gleaming with a lazy, predatory lust, saw her as just another part of their inheritance. Their advances became more persistent, their compliments more cloying. It was a gilded cage, and she knew she had to escape before the door was locked for good. She left in the middle of the night. With nothing but the clothes on her back and a hardened resolve, she found refuge in the one place that welcomed all of society's outcasts, the gambling houses and salons of the demi. Here, beauty was not a liability. It was currency. She became a hostess in a high-class establishment, a place where aristocrats and financiers came to shed their public personas and indulge their private vices. She learned to pour wine without spilling a drop, to laugh at jokes that were not funny, to listen to the secrets of powerful men with an expression of rapt attention, all while revealing nothing of herself. She was an ornament, a beautiful piece of furniture that coped